Well, I'm coming to you from the parking lot of a golf course. I couldn't find a hole they'd let me set up on to do this, and there's a reason for this environment. The day is ending. We're hoping to have enough light to do this. And I actually had the privilege. We have sitting next to me is Parrish. He and his wife are longtime friends of Sarah and myself. When we went to Maryland, the Lord led us there to pastor. He and his wife were a part of that church. And then the Lord called him to preach, and he has just celebrated 30 years in ministry. Got to tell you, that makes me feel old. So they came down to spend some time with us. And while the videos we've been shooting in the past have been in respect to revitalizing churches and turning churches around, I know that every story isn't a story that looks and sounds good in the process. And while we've spent time together and I've tracked with Tinney's ministry, he's in that season of life because of age and service where everything isn't glitz and glamour in terms of ministry. And he finds himself facing a new challenge in this season of his life and asking the questions that he realizes somewhere along the way he should have been asking anyway. And so now he's looking for answers. And I thought, what better way to celebrate God's faithfulness in a rebirthing process than to talk with somebody that I trust and I love, and we spent a lot of time on the golf course mentoring him in ministry those years ago. And we never solved anything, but we had a lot of fun looking for solutions in the woods, safe to say. And so while they were with us, I wanted to make him a part of this interview process and have him sort of share his story, because I know many of the churches that will log on and be able to watch this and listen to this are churches that haven't figured it out. They're on a downward spiral. The plane is running out of fuel, and the landing is not all that certain. Why not have a dialogue about that sort of journey as somebody is legitimately looking for those answers? And so, Tinney, I appreciate your playing only as we've looked for a place to actually do this that didn't have road noise and didn't have a band playing and screaming kids everywhere. And so this is where we are. So I want to begin by your just telling a little bit about your early life. I mean, where did you grow up in your home life and your earlier sort of religious or spiritual influences?
Well, I grew up in Baltimore, in the Brooklyn section of Baltimore, and my folks didn't go to church, so I don't have a growing up type of church experience. We played curveball in the street, and Betty Milburn from the little church down in Curtis Bay, she come up my street and said, anybody want to go to Vacation Bible School? It was the 60s, so all I had to do was tell my folks I was going, and I hopped in the car with her, and off I went to Vacation Bible School. And that was in the summertime of when I was 11, and February, right after I turned 12, I prayed to receive Christ, and have written in my Bible, the happiest day of my life was the day that I prayed to receive Christ. And from that time on, I have known and that God had things for my life. I didn't spend my teenage years listening to him, but I did know that he had a claim on my life. And I met Michelle, my wife, and she got me back worshiping and being with other believers at First Baptist Church Brooklyn, and that's where God put our paths together years later, you and I, and that's how we eventually met. And so it's been an interesting journey to get from Pontiac Avenue in Brooklyn to First Baptist Brooklyn to get to South Carolina in 2022. It's interesting.
Yeah. So we arrived in Maryland in June of 1990. We were all much younger then. I don't even know how old you and Michelle were when we arrived. Now, y'all were a young couple, had two very small. Matter of fact, Andrew was just a baby. Is that what year was he born?
He was born in 1991.
Okay, so he came along after we were there.
He came along after. Yeah. We had the Thursday morning prayer meetings at Terry's, and y'all prayed for Andrew to be successfully delivered.
Now, y'all had lost a child, Stephen,
We did.
and when had that occurred?
That was in 1987.
1987. So that had been 3 years prior to our coming, and y'all were still, I think, somewhat dealing with that sense of loss even then.
Oh, well,
Yeah, very, very much so.
still are.
Yeah, still are. Well, and you will always bear that with you. So I don't know. We arrived in June from Texas, and I got to tell you, it was a cultural shock for us. We tried to go to the mission field overseas, tried to go to Africa or Southeast Asia or anywhere, tried to go to Canada, tried to go to the Northwest Territory, tried to go everywhere, and God sent us to Baltimore, to that mission field there. And so I've told people I got sentenced when I sent there, but I have no regrets because of what God did while we were there. And so we arrived in June, and this is a different environment, a different culture, and people's lifestyles are different, and the houses they lived in were different. And I think it was like in the first week or the second week we were there when I came over to your house for a visit. I think it was a Thursday night, if I remember correctly. And so these are people I'm just trying to get to know and try to feel out how to engage ministry here. The church was, it was by reputation a good church, a strong church, a healthy church, and yet it was evident that they were just sort of rocking along, content with the status quo. And so I'm at their house on a Thursday evening, and it comes a downpour. I mean, it was a gully washer. And we didn't have cell phones back then. That didn't come along. But Sarah knew where I was, and she called the house and said, "Is James there?" And she said, and I got on the phone. She said, "You got to come home. Our basement is flooding." And we lived in a parsonage back then, and had those casement windows that were just above ground level. And on that uphill side of the house, water had filled up where that casement window and looked like an aquarium. And the debris floating around, and every gap around that window there was water. It looked like a cartoon, water squirting through. And of course, we hadn't unpacked everything, and there's stuff all over the basement. And so that was our introduction and our welcome to Maryland, and where we really began that sense of conversation. And God did some stuff, and we don't have time. I mean, too much water under the bridge. A lot of things that God did, but in that process, we began introducing change in that environment. And now looking back, because I know your perspective is going to be a little bit different because time and circumstances, but you still got a good mind. Y'all need to know that he does have a good mind. I didn't say a healthy mind, but I said a good mind. So in that early summer when we began to introduce change, do you recall what your take was on what we were doing that was different?
I have a sense that there was an excitement. We had a new guy, and we were, because our pastor had left, and I think we were feeling responsible that he had left. I think we were excited to try to have a new page. I don't remember specific things because the particular age group that I belong to, we had a large group, and it's like any other group in church. If your folks are still coming and things are normal, you don't really tend to see the rest of the things. Yeah. We had a good sized group, and it seemed healthy to us. But there was an excitement that we could learn to try some new things, and there seemed to be a general idea that we'd like to do that.
Yeah,
I know they told you that.
Yeah, that's a whole nother video on things that search committees tell prospective pastors, and prospective pastors tell search committees. They all know the questions in advance, and they all know the right answers. if they want the job, or they're trying to get that. And so that first summer that was beginning to unfold. Did you realize at the time, or in hindsight, did you realize why I directed so much of my attention and focus to that young adult crowd that was in the church? Or
Yes.
did you give any thought to it?
No, I understand how that works out, and it seems to me that my memory of those years ago, and I was 30 when you came.
Okay.
We had experienced good growth from the younger age demographic, and And from that, then other ages came. Their children, but also their parents and their grandparents came. And so it I don't know that it struck me or other people as odd, because we had already seen that played out. And so you didn't have to convince at least me that it made sense, because I'd seen it work. I'd seen the church grow right from that, from a youth group that grew, and new people came in all age groups from that youth group. It was and it hadn't been long before you had come. It was within our memory.
Yeah. Well, the fact that we're now 32 years removed from those events, and while we were there for 3 years, and God did something, because people came from everywhere, overran the place, caused all kinds of issues. At what point? Well, first thing is evidently the fact that we're sitting here after all this much time is that there was an affinity that we shared as a result of those. Do you remember perhaps an early instance of what sort of laid the groundwork or created that we developed a friendship that we've shared over this time?
Well, I've never underestimated the value of bad golf to create a bond within people. You know, it is hard to find someone that you can beat at times, and I think we both enjoyed the fact that on any given day we might be the winner. But thinking back on it, James, I didn't have any thought that I was perfectly happy. I was a banker. I was perfectly happy being a banker. I had a very good job. I liked what I did. I felt important. I felt like I had a wonderful future. I can chalk it all up to God threw us together, and the affinity was there because you were. It was your destiny to help me to get going and get started in ministry, and it was my destiny to be at the right place at the right time, that when God said, this is what I want you to do, he had already put in place the help that I was going to need so that I could get started to do it.
Because the question I always ask the people that I'm interviewing about their sense of call to preach and frame that, because it's unique to each person. If you were to take a few sentences and describe that season when you felt like God was calling you to preach, the thing that shaped that, the moments, the events, the circumstances that led you to it, how would you describe that?
Well, I think my general experience in life, it was played out, I got a good glimpse of that, is that when God's calling, everything else, it doesn't look as attractive as it once did. You would have never been able to convince me in 1989 that I wasn't going to be the youngest bank president in Maryland state history, because that's what my goal was. I loved what I did, and it fed all of the secular needs that I would have. And then there came a day when it wasn't attractive anymore. It wasn't all that. And I mean, how else can you explain that you're willing to do something that's going to be 1/4 of the salary that you made? And you're going to be very
if
happy. Well, that's the actual number. And it was very clear to me that God was calling. I heard it very clearly. I heard it despite the fact that I had numerous obstacles to get over in order to make that happen, because I hadn't finished college yet, because, well, I was making a lot of money. I didn't need to. I could have made more, but I was making a good salary, and I had a very good job, and I was playing softball, and I was enjoying life and playing golf, and everything was seemingly, not everything in my life, but everything was very positive. And then it was almost as if nothing is going to work unless you preach.
Yeah.
Nothing is going to be right unless you preach. And everything that you do, it's not just going to not be as attractive as it was before, but you see it in a whole different light. I grew to where the whole idea of being a banker, it frustrated me so much because I didn't want to give it up.
Yeah.
And I started with wanting to do both, but that's only because I didn't want to let one of them go. But God was very clear. He's very helpful to me because he understands my weaknesses, and he made being a banker and doing banker work seem like a waste of my time and something I didn't want to do.
What was because evidently you keep records. What was the date that you have assigned to that moment when you surrendered?
Well, I would say the day that it was physical was 1992 in January when I preached my first sermon.
Okay, well that was my follow-up question because I wasn't inside your mind or your
Yes.
soul. I was simply an observer or a spectator or a removed participant in that sort of journey with you. So tell about that leading up to and that first experience of preaching.
Well, at Brooklyn, when you became a deacon, they had lots of different ways to train you, I think they did a very nice job of training deacons on how to do the various deacon functions. And one of the things that they did spend considerable time on was that I should be able to share my faith, and that I should be able to lead Bible studies, and I should be able to, if I had to, I should be able to stand up for the preacher. If he can't make it one week, I should be able to fill the pulpit because that's what the church expected. So on Baptist Men's Day of 1992, because I was the lowest on the totem pole deacon, I got chosen to do that. And even though it snowed and I had to wear boots and I had to shovel snow in the front of the church before the service, I got to give my first sermon, and it was an obligation. It wasn't something that I asked for, and it wasn't something that I wanted. I tried to get out of it, but the chairman of the deacons, Carl Saar, he very gently worked it so that I eventually said yes and did what I was supposed to do. But that was a day when it was very clear to me that something that I didn't know that I could do was a call on my life, because I still have a cassette tape of the sermon, but I haven't listened to it since I had a cassette tape player 25 years ago. But I do know it wasn't a good sermon mechanically. It wasn't a good sermon. If you viewed it at seminary, you could find all kind of holes in it. But very clearly, it was the best sermon I could ever do, because with what little skill I had, I gave God's message, and God used it to touch other people, and I felt the sense of call that that's what he wanted me to do with the rest of my life.
And there was somebody who responded.
Yes, a guy named Scott Chalk, and he's no longer here. He's with the Lord, but he came forward during the sermon, and you talked to him at the front of the church, and you eventually baptized him and his wife, he was my plumber. And he was my plumber for decades. And every time he would come to fix my sink, before he would leave, he would shake my hand and say, "I haven't forgotten that it was you preaching the day that I knew Christ," and that was the most special day in my life. And I'm very thankful for that day.
Yeah. It's important to note is that this was January of '92. We had been there 2.5 years, and the Lord had blessed, and so there was a much bigger crowd in that season of journey that he had to speak to than what had been when we were there. And because our focus was on reaching unchurched people, to take the church and turn it inside out, over all the objections and the resistance we felt, that Scott represented really a first fruit. While we had people coming and we were reaching people and baptizing people, he represented that neighborhood, which was a neighborhood in transition. And so he represented somebody that didn't grow up with a church background or the kind of history the church people had, and he and his wife, they represented what we were actually trying to accomplish there. And he became a lifelong friend too, until he checked out to be with the Lord. And so that was the beginning, but that was in January. And it was actually the following January, after I had attended a conference in Texas, that I came back and announced to the church that God was calling me to plant a church, to leave Brooklyn because we'd exceeded the space there, and the property, the buildings, the location weren't worth fighting over. I don't know if you remember those conversations, but that God was saying go and start from scratch to where you have greater opportunity and potential without the limitations of space or tradition to be able to do that. Now the question is for you in recollecting, because that was really the church that you'd known, you'd become a part of, you'd become a deacon, now you'd sooner to preach in that environment, that context. What was your understanding based on our time of talking about it? What I felt like God was leading me to do that didn't fit in there, or that was not the place for it?
Well, I think that in many respects that the church was a victim of its own success, because so many people started coming in that that does unnerve people, and if they come in and they're quiet and they write a check, we love them. If they come in and they write a check and then they want to have influence on what you do, that's not quite the same thing. And I think that there was too much of a good thing, if you can have that, for some folks. And I think that fear is a big element in people's lives. And with a world that's changing around you constantly, you want something that stays the same. And for a great deal of people, if you can't have anything the same, you at least want your church to be the same.
Yeah.
And because it's special to you and you love it, and you remember it in a way that it really never really was, but in your mind it is. And I think that when you start knocking out walls and changing the way things look, and
he's not talking about figuratively knocking out walls. He's talking about physically knocking out walls. Go ahead.
Well, for so many years, everything's been good.
Yeah.
It's been good enough for all of us.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to change, but it at times scares people. And I just think that there was at least one year where there was so much overwhelming evidence that God is doing a new thing. That I didn't know Scott.
Yeah.
But Scott came in, I think Scott came in because of the small groups that got started. And when the small groups that got started, which wasn't very well received at first, but it was a long time ago, but went from 1 or 2 Bible studies to there were more people participating in the weekly small groups than there were participating in the church Sunday school program. And that caused people to be alarmed. Unfortunately, it did. And it is unfortunate that for some folks, it was almost like there were 2 different churches at the same time, and that creates an unfortunate atmosphere.
Okay. All right. In the interest of time and the setting sun and the waning light, to sort of fast forward into life, you went off, began pastoring, you went back to school, got your bachelor's degree, and then you went off to seminary, and you got further pastoral experience there. Learned you figured out that Mayberry wasn't for you as much as you liked Andy Griffith. That those small environments, you were a city boy and city life and city context. During that whole season, I mean, you saw what, and you came back and for a season shared that journey with us at NAC, and as Michelle will say, we did things very differently from what they had been done, sort of unfamiliar. Did you in any way embrace what we were trying to do, or was it just simply something else that was being done by you along the way without assuming on the future or projecting on the future what ministry was going to be for you?
Well, I have always felt that there are some people who are called to new work and new things. There are people that are called to be church planters and they get things started. There are other people that are called to pastor churches that have been planted. And I find beauty and worth in both. When I was at North Rundle Church, the way that you did things was merely different. But the difference between us is I have a special affinity and love for the established church, and feel that despite all of the decades of frantic church planting, there are still tens of thousands of Southern Baptist churches that are older churches that have served the Lord in various capacities for centuries, and somebody is called to pastor them, and I always felt it was me.
Yeah.
And I love the church. I love traditional church. I have a connection to that, and it plays a song in my soul that I'm called to it. You're called to a different type of church that I'm not called to, and I would never interact and meet the people that you meet, but somebody has to. And it's the beauty of the call, is that God calls different people to do different things. And I've never understood the notion that you have to be one or the other. I think they're both vital.
Yeah. So fast forward, you got your bachelor's, you went to seminary, Southeastern, you got an MDiv, and you continued to pursue through your various church ministries till you finally got a DMin. And then 14 years ago, you got called to Norfolk. Is
Yes.
that correct?
Yes.
And so you went there, and it suited you perfectly. A historic building, beautiful worship space, very committed to how church had been done, tradition, and the suit fit. The shoes fit. And you and Michelle both were just happy as you could be to be in that environment. And your ministry was basically enjoyable and fruitful, and all the positive things you would have checked the boxes until COVID. Would that be an accurate?
Well, it took COVID for me to look to see why we're struggling because of COVID, which then made it clear that we actually were struggling before COVID, but because the difference between plateau and decline, if there's small gradual decline over a period of years, if you lose 2 people a year, you don't notice it, but 20 years later you've lost half your congregation.
Yeah.
That's a lot. And it took COVID to sit down and say, okay, well, it's for sure things have changed. What caused it and what can we do? All of a sudden the light bulb goes off. Well, COVID caused a great deal of the change, but the change had already started before COVID.
Can you summarize the unique nature of your ministry there because of its location with that world?
Well, we were fortunate fortunate's not a good word. It's a transient area, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It's a college town with ODU, and there's a regional medical school right across the street from the church, and the world's largest Navy Yard is in our community. Tens of thousands of people come into our community every year. They're going to be there a little while. They're away from home, and many of them are they are lonely, and they're looking for friends. And our goal at Central was we'll be that friend. And so over the years, we were able to minister to people who were already believers, who were looking for a new church home that they could serve in for a couple of years while they were there. And they would come in, they would give their gifts and talents, and then they would leave. We were able to meet people brand new who receive Christ as their Savior, get baptized, get working and being a disciple and learning, and then they would move off. And it was really very, very nice until COVID came along, and all of a sudden COVID pointed out the glaring problem with the way that we did business. We were so blessed to have so many people coming in that we didn't have to do anything to get people to come in. And because of that, we weren't. In most cases, we didn't have to cook the Thanksgiving dinner, we just had to eat it. Well, what happens when there's no dinner? We didn't know how to cook one. Wow. And unfortunately, COVID has forced us to realize that we've been being spoon-fed folks into our church for years, that while we have been there, while we have opened our doors, while we have been hospitable and made them friends, while we worked hard to make them disciples, there was an element missing. And now we're forced to realize that, you know what, if we're going to make a change, see, now, because there's not as many folks coming into the school, and there's not as many folks coming into the medical school, and there's not as many folks coming into the Navy Yard as there was before. Now we're realizing that, wait a minute, there's still tens of thousands of people within 1 mile of the church. We have a huge mission field, vibrant community, full of folks, full of ministry opportunity. There's everything any church could ever want right there. You don't have to have a car. You can just walk to it. The problem is we have to get ourselves where we're slowly realizing that the only way we're going to turn things around is we've got to go. See, COVID's not a bad thing, right. And I'm not being trite. Right. The ugly sickness and people dying, I'm not being disrespectful, but COVID is actually a good thing if it makes you realize something that's fundamentally wrong, that we weren't doing our job. We were doing a part of a job, but we weren't doing the most basic element of the job, and I didn't have to teach people. You taught, when you were at Brooklyn, you taught people evangelism explosion. I didn't have to do that because it exploded in our church every Sunday. Instead, people came in, they heard the gospel, they went to a small group, they got saved, they got baptized, they made friends, and everything was wonderful. Nobody had to be the one to be Andrew to go get a friend to bring them in. Right. And now when we look, we say, well, you know, that what's different now than before COVID? Well, what's different now than before COVID is we still open the doors on Sunday. We don't get near as many people. Are there still as many people out there? There's more people than ever out there. But we have gotten, we are untrained and ill-experienced to handle it, but we're going to fix that.
Yeah. So if we were to make a short list, let's make it a short list of 3.
Okay.
What are the questions that you're having to answer now from your seat as the principal spiritual leader in that context, in that environment, that you weren't having to answer before?
How can I engage? The most important question to me is, how can I engage? My church is a drive-in church. Mm-hmm. Most of our members do not live in the neighborhood. It's not because of the neighborhood being different racially or economically. It may be economically. It is a well-to-do neighborhood, and so it is expensive for people to live there, and that's why lots of folks they can't afford to live there, and I completely understand that. But there isn't a problem with the our church looks like the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. The problem is our church people have an affinity for the people in the building. We don't have a problem making friends with people once they get in the building. My biggest deal is, how do I get the folks at Central to engage in a community that they don't live in, so that they can make relationships with people in our neighborhood. I'm very happy for them to bring their friends from Chesapeake and from Portsmouth and from Virginia Beach, but the reality is that most people aren't going to drive 20 miles to go to church. They're not going to come downtown to a old church building that's beautiful in every way and gorgeous and in a great section of town with a million places that you can eat, and it's a very nice place, but they have to drive past 50 churches to get to us. But the people in Ghent, they can walk to our church, and they could, and they will, when we get ourselves acclimated and focused that it is our job not just to receive them when they come in, but to go get them so that they come in. That's the biggest thing. How can I engage them? And so at our church, we are actively involved in coming up with ways that we can engage our community, getting our folks serving our community. Our church has a long history of serving the community through homeless ministry and through helping at the hospital, providing spaces for people to stay who are in crisis at hospital. So we already had that as part of our DNA. Now it's focusing it outward from meeting the needs of people who are down and out to realizing that the most down and out thing about our community is they don't know Christ. And a relationship with us will be the connection that will help to make that happen. I think that's the biggest issue that we have to do. I think that's the biggest, and I think, if I know the folks that go to Central, I think they just need a push, because once they experience it, they will want more. They will enjoy it, because we've had a good thing, and it's caused us to get soft and to get our eye off of it is hard. It is easier to deal with people who've already chosen you because they came in the door.
Yeah.
It's another thing to talk to 25 people over the space of a month and get 24 no's.
Yeah.
But you learn how to do something when you have to do that.
Yeah.
We didn't have to before,
yeah.
and we have to now. I think I know you asked me for 3, but
yeah.
I think that is our biggest issue right now.
Well, sorry to have to break in this at this point in the video, but it was necessary because of what is actually transpiring. Just a brief explanation. Tinney and I had visited 4 different locations to try to find a place to shoot. My wife, Sarah, was at home in bed. She had a kidney stone that she had passed on Saturday, and trying to find a time to interview Tinney and trying to vacate the house. We spent an hour in the afternoon on Sunday, late in the day. So what is happening at this point in the video is the sun is setting and it is getting dark. And I went ahead and let the video run. So indulge this inconvenience. But just think of it this way, the subject matter that we're talking about, the issue that are plaguing churches, they're as subtle as the setting of the sun, because when we were sitting there, we could tell it was getting darker. We didn't realize how quickly it would go black on us, and you'll see at the end what I'm talking about. So indulge me, the audio will play very well. If I can tweak the video, I'll try to do that, but I trust that you stay the course to the end of this, because I think it's worth listening to. I thank you for playing along and encouraging us and praying for us. Now back to the video.
Now, typically in my interviews, in the kind of ministry I do in helping churches with transition, most people always think in terms of formulas, how you do church. And so the way to effectively reach people you don't reach before was change how you do church, whether it's the music or the order of the service or the schedule, or, I mean, all those kind of variables. I want to look past that. And based on our friendship, and I think you're eminently qualified to articulate this because you're a good communicator, what it is that Tinney needs to do in providing leadership going forward to accomplish those things that aren't just about rearranging the deck chairs on the sinking ship.
Sure. Well, every pastor is supposed to set the example. Mm-hmm. And so if when COVID came along, we stopped going to our next door neighbor's house. We'd say hello from a distance. Mm-hmm. That has to get back to the way it was before. Mm-hmm. I have to set the example. And lots of pastors, I hear at pastors' meetings, lots of pastors say things like, well, I'm the only one that's doing anything. Mm-hmm. And I would say this: if you're the only one doing anything, you are being the example that your church needs to see, and keep on doing it. I have to be the example. If I'm going to ask folks who live in Chesapeake to engage people in Ghent, I have to be making a part of my communication through sermons and lessons. I have to be giving them examples of myself engaging people in the community that I live in, so that it isn't this is what I'm teaching you to do, but I don't actually do it. I have to do it. I'm convinced that when a great deal of, if instead of picking some worn out story to tell as an illustration, something that might get a laugh or get people to go, oh, at the end, if I told them about where I met someone in the Harris Teeter lot, and through pointed and purposeful conversation, I eventually got to talk to that person and invite them to come to my church. It points out the example that they're supposed to be. Good people, and I think that Central has many, many good people. They want an example. And if they see that in me, that will make a difference. And I don't think that the pastors who feel bad that they're the only ones should continue to feel bad. We are called to that. I think that a lot of times we have a frustration about it, other people not doing it, because we're really not doing it either. I haven't been doing things because of COVID, but COVID is over now, and I have to get back in the game.
Okay. There's so much more we could talk about, but night has fallen upon us. We're not getting a tan, and you're not able to see us because of that, but we're down to shooting light now at the end of the day. So I appreciate your willingness to play along as we found a place outside in a beautiful setting to have this conversation.
I do like Spanish moss.
Yes. So if you were to ask the people who watch this and listen to this, to pray for you and your ministry, what specifically would you ask them to pray for?
Well, I think that if you prayed for Central Baptist, that you pray that we would have a heart that is concerned about our neighborhood, their spiritual lostness. Our church is very good at giving out things to meet physical needs. They're very kind, very generous. When our hearts are broken, because you remember Carson Broyles.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes.
Carson Broyles cried when he read about starving people who were lost in Africa. And I remember at Brooklyn, a lot of the older fellas, they made fun of him because they didn't cry. You know, today I look back at that and I think that was a problem. They didn't cry about folks who were lost. But I can't point fingers at those guys. Carson was the guy who was connected to the lostness. Our community is lost. And yet we have that wonderful answer. And if we have a burden that we're the only one that can, I would pray that our folks would have a burden that we're the only ones who can.
So in the last light, as we're talking out of the dark, as people are listening, for the record, for people to understand, is there anything in how you go about doing what you're doing that you're not willing to lead the church in doing to accomplish the end that you've just described?
I can't think of, off of the top of my head, I can't think of anything that I wouldn't do to lead them to love our community and love God and serving Him by sharing the gospel everywhere we go. I can't think that I would.
All right. This is one for the books. You saw it here first. I want to express my gratitude to Tinney for our friendship that's not done, to see what God does in your life and ministry, to be a part of that conversation journey going forward. And I appreciate your tuning in to watch this Laurel and Hardy routine of talking about church life and doing ministry. And if you have questions that you'd like to ask of Tinney or of me in these conversations, because I'm always looking for the best way to do things, then contact me at this email address you see on your screen. If you'd like to be a part of our supporting community that supports us financially so we can continue to do ministry, then here's an address if you want to simply drop a check in the mail or write to me about how to do this electronically. But thank you for indulging us in the imperfect way that we're trying to do the perfect thing for the kingdom, not because it's without flaw, but because it's complete in what God has called us to do. Thank you, Dave. That's a wrap.